He had been brought up to exercise self-control, and had been lectured at home, in school, in church, that it was wrong to blaspheme. The mosquitoes were feeding off him now, and when he hissed at them, some took advantage and flew into his mouth and found his tonsils and went behind his yellowed teeth, and he had to stop himself spluttering. It was the dogs he feared most. The engineers had brought them, and the older, fiercer ones were kept hungry and were tied to running wires, but there were also the family dogs and puppies that some of the men were fond of. Pablo knew about the dogs from the many times he had edged close to where the work was taking place on this bank of the upper reaches of the Amazon River. The only times in his life that he had been close to messing his trousers had been when he was close to the big shelter that had been built, and where a generator throbbed, and where the dogs barked, sometimes in a frenzy and sometimes out of boredom. Men patrolled the perimeter of the site, where the cleared ground met the wall of the jungle. They carried automatic weapons, and he presumed them to be veterans from the war with the guerrillas. They had faces as hard as those of their guard dogs. Pablo had not been in the military, had never owned a firearm. Here, away from the town, a shot would not be heard, and a body could be quickly lost. A shallow pit would suffice, or a splash in the river, and a brief feeding opportunity for catfish and piranha. He had seen the strange craft grow over the period of 7 weeks that he had been coming to this place, and each time he came he was more terrified. After pillars had been sunk and the steel frame erected, a roof had been built to cover the first stages of the craft's construction. Day after day, and usually long into the night, the generator moaned and cried, and the welders had fastened the fierce lights, and hammers had belted at the joints, and twice a week Pablo had taken up his position and had observed. It was a huge project, building the craft. Would have cost more money than he could imagine, here in the dense jungle beside the river, and with skills that he could barely comprehend. He did not know where it would sail to, how far, and through what dangers, if it were not assembled with every rivet, nut, bolt, and sealant secured, and an engine inside that must not fail, and the risk, so great, of the men in it drowning. But he did know what its cargo would be. The white powder that ruled with such violence and brought such rewards. Pablo had felt quite safe at the start, but it was different now, as the long length of the hull had become recognizable, and more men had come to the site by the slipway that a bulldozer had fashioned. More armed men and more dogs, and all of them hungrier. Last week a portable crane had lifted the diesel engine into place. The fuel tanks were already there, and the previous evening they had been filled, and Pablo had estimated that the tanks had each been capable of carrying 20,000 litres. A small, squat tower sat on top of the craft, and he had seen 2 men who disappeared into the hatch more often than the others, and he assumed they would sail with it when it was launched and went down the river towards the open ocean. It frightened Pablo, now that it had taken the shape of a boat that could travel underwater, just to look at it. And he tried to imagine how far away was its destination. When they had tested the engine at the back, it had raced, chucking out fumes, acrid and black. Pickups arrived in convoy, came along the track to the building, inside which the craft had been built. Pablo thought the cargo was stored here because those who held the guns had become more menacing, and the dogs took a cue from them. There was a bedlam of noise. Pablo needed to be closer, needed to see better. And fear became almost terror. He knew, as would anyone who lived in that town on the Colombian frontier, where the state's boundary was marked by the winding path of the Amazon River, what fate would be handed out to him if he went too close. But he moved forward, and the mosquitoes attacked his face in waves.